When we're younger, we tend to put adults on this high pedestal. They're supposed to be perfect. Always perfect. Always protect us. Always be brave. Always be good. I guess as kids, we don't understand that life just doesn't work like that. Sometimes even as adults, we forget that it's very easy to be weak. We forget that no one's perfect. Life is difficult. We forget that behind closed doors, some people are exactly who they portray themselves to be, and sometimes they aren't. Growing up, I lived on a very quiet street. Nothing exciting really ever happened. My mom used to say that we weren't rich by any means, but we were comfortable. And that certainly made us more fortunate than a lot of people. It was a really safe neighborhood. Everyone had good jobs, and back then, you knew every single one of your neighbors. There were block parties, barbecues, and birthday parties. Everyone always attended. It was a normal occurrence for neighbors to just stop by and ask if you could watch for their kids, or even their house. Water their plants, feed their animals while they were away on trips. That just doesn't really happen much anymore. I suppose it depends on where you live. Now, it seems we all lock our doors. We dread when the phone or the doorbell rings. Instead of welcoming who's ever on the other end, whether it be the phone or the door, we try and pretend that we're not home. It's just safer and easier that way. In the late 70s, when I was about 10, my neighbor Rusty Hubert was going away on a trip. He offered me $10 to feed his cat for 4 days. I was so excited. You see, I wasn't allowed to have pets at the time, not yet anyway. So not only was I going to get to spend as much time as I wanted with a cat, I was getting paid for it. So that was just amazing to me. And Rusty's house was only 3 houses away. So it wasn't even that far of a walk. He had a calico cat that was very frisky. She loved batting at the yarn that I brought over. I spent over an hour playing with that cat. And I'll admit, looking around at Rusty's things, he had a lot of interesting stuff. He was a widower, volunteered often at the church, and worked at the hardware store. He had lots of classical music records and a very expensive-looking record player. I was tempted, but didn't dare touch it. My dad wasn't very enthusiastic about me spending time there. He was okay with me feeding the cat, but he didn't like the idea of me spending more than 10 minutes over there because he thought that I was being nosy and that I might accidentally break something. It just wasn't something that you did back then. It was embarrassing if you were nosy, I guess. So I promised that I'd be no more than 10 minutes on the last day before Rusty came home. I walked into his house and quickly fed the cat. I thought, okay, this is my last chance to really look around. He's got such neat stuff. I really wanted to see what he had upstairs and figured no one would ever know. As I placed my foot onto the third step, a loud banging came from upstairs. I could see a door at the very top. I had no idea where it led to, but it sounded like someone or something was banging on the other side of it. I was so startled that I was frozen for a minute. Then I heard banging from a different direction. My eyes flew to where the sound was coming from. I saw the basement door. Something was banging on that too. I was scared out of my wits. I can't even tell you how I got out of that house, shut the door, and ran back to my parents' house. I really can't. I blocked that part out, but somehow I made it home. I immediately told my dad what had happened. He could tell from the look of fear on my face that I wasn't making it up. Fearing someone might have broken into Rusty's house, he grabbed my baseball bat and walked over himself. He grabbed one of our male neighbors that was outside to go with him. They were gone for about 15 minutes. When my dad walked back into the house, he looked white as a sheet. He made me go upstairs, and when I asked what happened, he barked at me again to go upstairs, and I knew better than to ask questions at that moment. I tried to put my ear to the door and listen to my dad frantically tell my mom what had happened. "I have to call the police, Myrna," is what I could make out, as well as "everywhere, Myrna," strewed everywhere in that room. The police were waiting for Rusty when he arrived home and immediately arrested him. Later that day, they pulled something from his basement out on a stretcher. My father wouldn't tell me why at first. He would not tell me what was going on. But when it made the news, he couldn't keep it from me anymore. In one of Rusty's upstairs rooms, there were amateur photographs of dead children strewn everywhere. The police knew that he was the one that had taken them because they found darkroom equipment and his camera. The something that they pulled from his basement was the body of a 6-year-old boy who'd been missing for 3 weeks. Some of the photographs were of children who he confessed to having murdered previous years. The saddest part, not only were these children dead, and some of them weren't accounted for, and their families had no idea where they were, or that they were even dead, but someone innocent was already serving time in prison for a murder that they didn't commit. A murder that Rusty had committed. At least one person. After that, Rusty went to prison. The neighborhood was never quite the same. Everyone was thrown hard for a loop. The days of not locking our doors and opening our homes to everyone was over. Moms started walking their kids who were under 14 to the bus stop for quite a long time. It was the beginning of the end to the good old days. Eventually, 2 years later, a couple with a little girl bought the house. That sent shivers down my spine. I guess it shouldn't, because time moves on, and the only evil in that house was Rusty, and he's long gone. As I've grown up, I've learned that, sadly, it's not uncommon for people like Rusty to literally get away with murder, while someone else, often of color, is falsely accused and convicted with little to no evidence. I grew to understand that the world can be stupid and unfair. Some people are who they portray themselves to be, and others are not. Some people accused of things really did them. Others did not. But every life is precious. No one deserves to be murdered. No one deserves to be falsely convicted. I've heard people say, who cares if one person is falsely accused and convicted? Because most of them are guilty. As long as they get most of them, who cares? That's just wrong to me. Even one life ruined that didn't deserve it is wrong. This I know. One thing I don't know, and I've never been able to figure out, is the knocking. When I came home from college one summer, I asked a little girl who was now in high school if she'd ever heard any weird sounds in her house. She rolled her eyes and copped an attitude and said, no, nothing ever happens at her house. She apologized for her attitude and explained that she was just sick of people asking her things like that, and that she was well aware of what had happened at her house, but honestly, it was just a perfectly normal house. So it wasn't like it was some ghost that had stuck around to haunt the place. Had it been the spirit of one of those murdered children trying to warn me that day, just sticking around long enough to get someone's attention and then leave? My dad could never answer that question for me. In fact, for the longest time, he honestly thought I was lying about the knocking. He wasn't angry. He was just afraid that I had actually seen the pictures or the body and made up the knocking as a lie because I was frightened. But that isn't the case. I've read other experiences similar to mine, where the spirit of someone passed on gives a message and then disappears. I'll never know. But had it not happened, who knows how long Rusty would have been left to his own devices. And that is the scariest thing of all.